Well, greetings. My name is Walter Kondratowski, and I am the audio-visual technician that you hear so much about. I'm the one who gets to put together these online broadcasts, and it's my privilege to come and speak with you this morning. So here I am, and let's dive in. Alphonse Karr said, "We can complain because rose bushes have thorns, or rejoice because thorns have roses." Now, some of you might be familiar with the name Bret Michaels, but if not, I'll fill you in. In the late 80s, he was one of the founding members of a band called Poison. And they had not reached their superstar status that they now have enjoyed for many years. They were often broke, and on the road, they just weren't seeing the traction in their band that they were hoping for. And to make matters worse, Bret got a phone call from his girlfriend back home, and she told him that she had been seeing another musician from another band and that their relationship was now over. And so on the road, broken-hearted, Bret Michaels went across the street to the laundromat to wash his only other pair of pants and his only other shirt, and he brought his guitar along. And the way that this is described by the Professor of Rock on YouTube is that he began to strum these chords and imagine and write these new lyrics to a song that would one day make the band a household name. And the song goes like this: "Every rose has its thorn, just like every night has its dawn. Just like every cowboy sings a sad, sad song. Every rose has its thorn." And then the band would come in with a face-melting guitar solo. And the point of the song is that even beautiful things have their flaws and their challenges. And so it resonated with so many people that the record label said, "Oh, this song doesn't really seem like one that we would release as a single," but the band knew they were onto something when every night they would play shows and they would play the song and the women in the front row would just cry their eyes out. And sure enough, it became their only #1 hit. Well, the Apostle Paul was a lot like a rock star. As you may or may not be aware, he was a household name due to his traveling through the countryside, starting churches and sharing the gospel. He also had a message that many people considered, like rock and roll music in its infancy, dangerous and divisive. The gospel he was sharing got him into a lot of trouble. And despite many setbacks and frustrations and physical attacks, Paul would not relent. He was focused on his mission of preaching the gospel. And this is where we find him in the book of Philippians, where we're going to read today. He's been locked away in a prison, unable to share the gospel. And just like Bret Michaels in that laundry room turned to playing his guitar and writing lyrics, Paul is going to write a letter to a church in Philippi to tell them what he is going through. And he's going to teach them a valuable lesson by doing it. So let's read together Philippians 1:12 through 18. "I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice." Now, some of you might be feeling like you're in a prison of difficult circumstances. You might have difficult circumstances. You might be dealing with difficult people. You might be struggling with difficult emotions. All of us in this post-pandemic world have experienced what isolation and burnout and fear can do to our hearts and minds. And so that might be where you are today. You're looking at the world around you and recognizing that things just don't look very good. And there's a potential that you might be experiencing a crisis of faith where you lose all hope. But I'm here today to encourage you, that perspective can change everything. Just like perspective can write a great song out of heartbreak, or perspective can write a compelling letter out of a prison term. Your situation can change as well if you adapt the proper perspective. And that's what we're talking about. You're going to hear me say the word perspective more than you probably ever wanted to, but I'm going to give it to you this way. The first point is the proper perspective keeps the church on task and on target when facing difficult circumstances. Again, in 12 through 14, it says, I want you to know that what has happened to me has served to advance the gospel. So it's become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Paul acknowledges the difficulty of his circumstances, yet he immediately reframes them for the greater good. And the beautiful part of this is that even the guards are aware of the gospel. Paul he's under house arrest. He cannot leave to share the gospel with the churches that he's founded. And he's afraid of also his arrest might keep other believers from sharing their faith. And so this is this difficult circumstance that he is in. But what Paul begins to hear through open windows of the house he is in and through messages slid under doorways is that not only are the brothers not afraid, they've actually increased their boldness. And to make matters even better, the guards are all asking Paul why he's there. And Paul gets the opportunity to share the gospel with them. And they're telling each other about Jesus so that the whole Praetorian Guard, the whole Imperial Guard knows why Paul is there and in whose name he's been proclaiming good news. And so Paul looks around at his situation and he says, I am unable to leave the house, but yet God is using me to change the world still, even through these difficult circumstances. And that's what happens. These difficult circumstances, they allow us to believe and trust in the sovereignty of God and to reframe our thinking and to begin to look at things from that new perspective. A great story comes from, how many of you are watching this on a Mac or are watching this on an iPhone? Right? If you are, you have someone to thank. And that person, his name was Steve Jobs. And the story of Apple computers is just such an excellent example of why perspective matters. Every business at some point or another is going to face the difficult reality of extinction, right? Changing markets, changing consumer habits. But there's always that potential that if companies can't keep up, they'll become obsolete. And that was exactly what was happening in the late 90s, where Apple Computers just wasn't able to compete with Microsoft, who was releasing all of their Windows products and just had this amazing business model. And they were dominating the market. And so Apple decided to do something drastic. In 1997, they brought back their co-founder, Steve Jobs. And under new leadership, the fresh or proper perspective, Apple got back on task and on target, creating user-friendly, innovative products tied to an ecosystem of services. And they began to release these products like the iPhone and the iPad, which were all predated by our favorite, the iPod, right? Thousands of songs in your pocket is the biggest deal. But it was that change in perspective of putting the customer first, creating these incredible experiences that all of a sudden revitalized the whole company. And the world would be a very different place today if Apple had stuck to their model and tried to continue in that vein without recognizing that they needed to change. And it was the same for the Apostle Paul. If he could have gotten down in the dumps, he could have been depressed. He could have said, all right, my circumstances, I'm the victim here and there's nothing that I can do. And then the world would not have changed. If Steve Jobs had not taken that position, we would not have all of these fantastic devices that in many ways make our lives better. But the Apostle Paul, if he had gotten down in the dumps, all of a sudden the world would look very different, as the gospel would not have been proclaimed to the ends of the earth the way that he had been instructed. And so when we look at these things, we have to understand that our circumstances may be bad, but how we respond to those circumstances really makes the difference. You can believe that God is powerless to intervene, or you can choose to believe that God is working all things together for good for those that love him and are called according to his purpose, as Paul writes in Romans 8:28. Now, sing it with me. Every rose has its thorn. If you know it, you can sing along. Just like every night has its dawn. I'm sorry, that was terrible. All right, so the next portion of this is the proper perspective keeps the church on task and on target when facing difficult people. Now, just real quick, the task portion of this is the idea of sharing the gospel, right? The task is to share our faith, is to let people know the good news of Jesus. The target is our own hearts and minds and the hearts and minds of those around us, right? Discipleship is a huge element of that. So we have the task of evangelism and the target of discipleship. And these two things, when we have the proper perspective, all of a sudden everything lines up together. So let's go back to Philippians chapter 1, verses 15. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. Now, having the proper perspective about his circumstances bled into Paul's outlook on the people around him in his life. One of the things that will be apparent in a few minutes is that Paul sees his enemies as something else, right? And to put it in perspective for you, there was an opportunity. I began my ministry career as a worship director. And I can remember getting hired at one particular church where the pastors decided to throw a banquet and do like a little Q&A with all of the band members, with the new leader coming in. And they started to ask me all kinds of questions. And so we had dinner and we were asking questions. And they said, so what kind of music do you like? Well, I like hymns and I like the new songs. I like a mix of the two. What kind of guitars do you like to play? Well, I like acoustic and I like electric. I like them all. And then finally came the question, how do you feel about click? Now, if you don't know what click is musician slang for a metronome that you play in your ears while you are performing that keeps the band on task and on target, rhythmically, right? And so it's a little boop, 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 and you sing the songs and everybody stays together and it just helps everybody keep their timing. Well, I said, I think click is a valuable tool and I would love to implement it at some point. Well, you should have seen all of the faces turned to one guy who had decided to sit in the back, and his name was Mike. And Mike, if you're watching, miss you, buddy. Love you. We should do lunch. And his expression was kind of a grimace. His arms were crossed and he was shaking his head no. And so sure enough, all the other people in the room shaking their heads no. And I recognized that Mike had a lot of sway and he was one of the power brokers of the band. And so I had a choice to make. I had the opportunity to either make him my enemy and fight him to the death over this one thing, die on this hill, or I can recognize his influence, befriend him, and tap into that, whatever that was, that ability he had, or that reputation that he had. And so I chose the latter. I said, there's no way I'm going to win, but let's see if we could be friends. And so we did. I invited him to spend time with me. And it turns out that I'm pretty sure that's one of his love languages, because we would go out for dinner after practices and we would just talk. And I would ask him questions about what do you think would make the band better? And as he was a drummer, he said, one of the things we could really use work on is timing. And that was when I said, well, Mike, do you think click would help? And he said, no, I don't want to use click. But he said, yeah, that might do the trick. And so sure enough, the next couple of practices, I said, hey, everybody, gather around. We're going to begin using click. And immediately they all looked to Mike and they said, just to see what his reaction would be. And he was a kind of a gruff personality, but he was there with his arms crossed and scowl on his face, and he started to nod. And so they all started to nod. And it was this beautiful moment where Mike lost none of his agency, but I was able to accomplish something that I thought would help the band overall. And you can do that with the difficult people in your life. You can make them your enemies, and you can keep them your enemies, or you can make them your allies. And you can befriend them and love them and share the gospel with them. And hopefully those people who were once antagonists could become your best friends. And so Paul was similarly helpless to do anything about his situation. And there were people out there to get him. Now, those that he loved were out there sharing the gospel on his behalf. But then he had enemies who wanted him silenced, who wanted him quiet. They didn't want his message to get out. They didn't want him to be the one to get the credit for that message, right? And so what did his enemies do? They start proclaiming the gospel in order to upset him, because now they've stolen his message and they've stolen the credit, and now they're getting all of the accolades. And Paul sits back in prison, and I imagine he just went, God, you are up to something, because the people I love are doing my job for me, and the people that hate me are doing my job for me. This is unbelievable. But yet for Paul, honestly, for Paul, it kind of feels like it was just another day. And so he understood that God was going to work all things together for good. That's why he wrote that in Romans 8. And so, and one of the things that Paul will say later in the letter is that I'm going to read from the New King James Version, where he says, I know how to be abased and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Now, really, he's talking about the finances, which he's asking the Philippian church to help him with. But that's also a rule for life. Knowing how to do well when your friends are on your side, but knowing how to do well when your enemies are against you, is all part of keeping that perspective that God is up to something. He's doing something. And people often will put, God puts into our lives people who are difficult, I think, for a reason. They're an opportunity for us to grow. Think of those people who get under your skin the most. Those people who just make life more difficult. What if you treated them with love? There's just a brilliant, motivational speaker named Zig Ziglar who said, if you look at everybody as if they're hurting, you'll be right. And so what if we looked at everyone like they were hurting? Even as hurting people, what if we decided to love people like they needed to be loved? It would make a tremendous difference in our world, but it would also make a tremendous difference in our own hearts, because we wouldn't have that animosity towards them anymore. We wouldn't be they wouldn't be renting space or living in our heads rent free, as the saying goes. And so this played itself out in my own life, where one of my daughters came home from school, and she said that there was this boy who was bullying her. And you know that it's bullying because it's intentional, number one, and then it's repeated. And every day he criticized her for something new, found a flaw in her, made fun of her in some way. And so I gave her explicit orders. I said, I want you to go into school, into that classroom, and you are to kill that boy with kindness. Every time he criticizes you, compliment him. Every time he makes fun of you, tell him what you like about him. Every time he says something nasty, say something nice. And I'll tell you what, by the end of that school year, the two of them were friends. Sometimes hurting people don't know how to tell you they're hurting. And sometimes you just have to figure that out and love them anyway. And so it's time to sing again. Every rose, you gotta sing it with me. Every rose has its thorn, just like every cowboy sings a sad, sad song. Anyway, all right, the final point of our time together is that the proper perspective keeps the church on task and on target when facing difficult emotions. So Paul asks a question. He says, what then? And we've talked about the external circumstances, but what about the internal things? What about those emotions that have the opportunity to get the best of us? The author of Hebrews reminds us that the gospel is paramount, and that when we fix our eyes on Jesus, he is our model of living in joy despite enduring pain. Jesus bore our sin and our shame on the cross because of joy. And if that's the case, we should be asking, what can we endure if the joy of the Lord is truly our strength, as it says in Nehemiah 8:10? There's no way that we can avoid the hurt in a world broken by sin, but we can work to heal the pain in our hearts through the hope of the gospel. On September 21st of 2023, at 17 weeks, my wife gave birth to our son, and we named him Buddy because Buddy was the first name that she called him when she felt a move that first time. And we had gone in for a routine ultrasound to this was the one where we were going to get to determine the sex of the baby, and so we were all excited. And I have other children who are also like waiting with bated breath to find out what it was going to be. And, I was looking at the monitors and trying to figure it out on my own before the technician told us. And then the technician turned to my wife and said, "I'm so sorry, I can't find a heartbeat." Time just stopped, right? In those moments, there's nothing that can prepare you for that feeling where all of the hope is gone. All of what could be is gone. And you sit there kind of a shell of yourself wondering what to do next. And we held each other and we cried, and it was just these bitter tears. And they don't tell you any of this when you go through this, but they gave us a weighted teddy bear. And I was like, why in the world are you giving me a weighted teddy bear? This is kind of weird. And what it was, and I realized this kind of as we were leaving, that bear was coming with us, but our son was staying behind. And that was a hard thing for us to go through. But yeah, it was something that needed to happen in me. My emotions needed to shift, or my perspective, I should say, needed to shift. And that bear kind of, it made it all reality, right? It meant that we were taking this home instead of our son. It meant that we were going to be grieving, and this is going to be our new normal. And it's, like I said, it's helped us heal in a lot of ways, with that separation. And Paul knew that the gospel was worth suffering for. He went through prison, stonings, shipwrecks, and rejection. And, but all of those things to him paled in comparison to the love of God in Christ Jesus. And Paul's perspective was he saw the suffering that he endured as a means to a greater end. And he called it the upward call of Jesus in Philippians 3:14. Now, according to the National Library of Medicine, 26% of pregnancies end in miscarriage. And if that is the case, there are many more people who've gone through what I have experienced and are carrying that around in their hearts. And Paul calls us to bear one another's burdens. We have the power to lighten one another's load. Yes, I carry a great deal of pain, but when I share my circumstances and I share that pain with other people, not only does it give them the opportunity to share their pain with me and to sympathize with that, but together it creates this unity of shared grief where together we stand up underneath these things and we don't have to carry them around alone. And it's this beautiful picture of what the church is supposed to be. It's the kind of church I want to be a part of, where we carry each other's burdens. And that's one of the hardest parts of those circumstances and those people and those emotions, that they have the ability to weigh us down and to cause us to lose sight of what really matters. And that's loving people and loving God. And again, that's the hardest part, is that those difficult circumstances, man, they're going to pass. Eventually we get through them, or not necessarily through them, but we can move beyond them. The hurt will always be there, but we can get through them. Difficult people, man, eventually they move away or they die, right? And so that might give you hope this morning. But how we respond to the hurt in our hearts, that will make or break our faith. In the Discipline of Grace, Jerry Bridges reminds believers that on your worst day, you are not beyond the reach of God's grace, but that on your best day, you are not beyond the need of God's grace. And so in the midst of these circumstances and this emotional turmoil, we can find peace for our weary souls by choosing joy, by cultivating gratitude. Gratitude and lament are said to be two virtues that the church is losing the ability to experience. We're not grateful for the stuff that we have, and we're not able to properly mourn the things that we have lost. And just as we can find joy in roses despite the thorns, we can find joy in the midst of the most difficult circumstances when we choose to keep the proper perspective. Now, to tie it all together, someone once said that God is sovereign. Humans are responsible. Believe both, and you will go to bed each night with peace and wake each morning with purpose. The proper perspective has the potential to change our difficult circumstances into opportunities. It has the potential of changing difficult people into allies and friends. It has the opportunity, or has the potential, to transform our sorrow into joy as we experience love and care for one another. And the Apostle Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 4:16 through 18 that, so we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light and momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. And without trivializing the difficulties that you're experiencing, I hope that you will see them for what they are: preparation. I don't know how God plans to use your pain and suffering, but I know that it will not be wasted. For even if you never share that story, right, and you hold it inside, God has read that book from cover to cover. He's wept over it. He's wept over your loss. He's wept over the lost relationships. And he's wept over those sleepless nights that you spent in worry. He's wept over the loss of your only son too. I know you're probably sick of it by now, but it's time to sing one more time. Ready? Every rose has its thorn. You know what? You know the rest. Some of you are going through difficult situations right now. Others are dealing with difficult people every day. And then there are the unfortunate souls coping with difficult people, creating difficult situations. And all of this has the potential to weigh down our hearts. As we close our time together, remember that God is sovereign. He's working all things together for good. Trust in his goodness. Remember that you are responsible for choosing how you will respond. Choose joy. And above all, when you keep the proper perspective, your words and actions will take on new power as you live out the gospel in the world. Go and preach it with boldness. Thanks so much for letting me share with you today. May God bless you as you go on to the rest of your day and your week.